Hi, boys and girls. It's time for another story, and I bet you can guess what our stories are going to be about. It's almost time for Christmas. This is not my Christmas tree. This is my daughter's Christmas tree. But isn't it pretty? Our story today is called The Red Mittens. Well, John, he was sitting thinking. It was 1934. That was what he was thinking about. That was the year that for the first time in his life, he realized what it meant to have peace on earth, goodwill to men. And he would never have known it if it hadn't been for his little daughter, Linda, who was 8. Now, it was 1934, right in the middle, the worst time of the Great Depression. Do you know what a Great Depression is? That was a time in our country's history where all the banks failed. And what that meant was if you had money in the banks were all closed and you could never get it out again. All the farmers didn't have money to pay for their farms. It was an awful hard time. Now, John, just the year before all this, he had bought a section of land. That's 160 acres with a little farmhouse and a barn and a pasture, a place for his animals. Now, a lot of the people during the Depression were very, very hungry because they had no money to buy food. But John thought, God has blessed us. Their farm made all kinds of food. And they had cows, so they had milk, and they had chickens, so they had eggs. They weren't hungry, but there certainly wasn't money for anything else other than necessities. John came in one day and he turned to his wife, Jane, and he said, Jane, I'm sorry, but we just can't afford to have any Christmas this year. There's just no extra money. And Jane said, it's all right, John. And John said, I know it's all right for us, but it's not all right for little Linda. Linda was their only daughter. She had beautiful brown hair and great big brown eyes, and she was the joy of their life. Well, Linda, although she was just 8, she wasn't used to a lot of fancy things. She was just happy with her home on the farm. But when they did go into the town to buy the few necessities they needed, she liked to look in the store windows. And in the front of Lloyd's department store was a huge window. And I bet you're thinking, it's full of toys. But it wasn't. In that window was coats. And in the very front was a beautiful blue coat. That coat had a price tag of $12.59. In those days, that could be up to $100 in our money for that coat. But that little blue coat was just the right size for Linda. And she looked at it and she longed for that coat every time they went into town. She'd say, I want to go look in Lloyd's window and see if the coat is still there. Where Mommy and Daddy knew that. But even though it was only $12.50, they didn't have $12.50. So the little blue coat stayed there. Well, Jane, Linda's mommy, she'd gone up to the attic and she found a coat that she had had. And she very carefully cut it down to make it the size for Linda. And Linda, she never complained. She dutifully wore that coat. But it didn't compare anything to the blue coat in the window. But she never said anything. She never complained. Well, then it got closer to Christmas, and Mom had been up in the attic going through trunks and things to see if there was stuff she could make over. That means to make it into something new, or if there was stuff that she could decorate their house with. And Linda had gone to help her. Well, later on that day, Linda had ran outside with her coat and her mittens on to see if she could help her daddy. They were standing outside in the barn. She said to her daddy, "Daddy, I think I'm going to get Mr. Riggs a Christmas present." Daddy's eyes got big, and he swallowed hard, and he said, "Why would you want to give that old man a Christmas present?" Now I'm going to stop right here and tell you about Mr. Riggs. Mr. Riggs owned 500 acres right beside John's farm. He was old, but that wasn't his problem. He was sour, like a bitter apple. And he never smiled at anybody. He didn't even talk to people. In that farming community, there was a rumor that Mr. Riggs had money, but you would never know it because he drove an old Model T. It was so old that when it went down the road, it clinked and it clanked. And Model Ts, in the good weather, it had a roof over it, but the sides were open and the doors were half doors down here. And you could put curtains along those sides to keep the wind out and the rain out. But Mr. Riggs, he never put anything on his. He just grabbed a hold of that steering wheel till his knobby hands were white, and he drove along. He didn't look this way, he didn't look that way, he looked straight ahead. There was another thing. John's farm, they had a well, but they had a lot of cows and a lot of animals. And the one thing with farmers are they have to have water. Well, John had a well, but that meant going out every day to the water pump and pumping and pumping and pumping until he had filled buckets after buckets after buckets to fill the water trough for all those animals. It took him half the day just to water the animals. Now, right next to John's farm was Mr. Riggs's 500-acre farm, and his farm, the river went right by the edge of it. So he had no trouble about getting water. He would just shoo his cows down and they would drink for themselves. Ever since they had lived on their farm, John had gone numerous times to talk to Mr. Riggs. Could he please have what they call an easement, which is a little bitty strip of land that he could drive his cows to the river to get drinks? But Mr. Riggs, he would have none of it. "Nobody's going to drive any cows on my land." So John kept pumping water every day. And needless to say, he didn't like Mr. Riggs very well. So when Linda said she wanted to bring Mr. Riggs a present, he thought, why would you want to bring anything to that sourpuss? Well, he looked at Linda and he said, "What do you want to give him, Linda?" And she said, "Oh, Daddy, I want Mommy to make some zero mittens." Well, zero mittens were kind of special for the people lived in North Dakota where it gets really cold. Zero mittens, Mommy would cut out the shape of a mitten out of an old pair of Daddy's overalls. Then she would cut out the shape of a mitten out of an old blanket, and that would make it 4 layers thick. And then she would sew it all together, and then at the bottom that would go around your arm, she knitted that part and she hooked that on to the bottom of the mittens. And then Daddy's hands were always warm. She said, I want 0 mittens, because she had seen that Mr. Griggs, he didn't have any mittens on his old knobby hands. Before John even thought about what he was going to say, he said to her, you don't need to give that old man anything. Besides, he probably wouldn't wear the mittens after you gave them to him. Little Linda's face kind of crumpled, and she put her head down, and she stood there. She didn't cry, but she just stood there, and she started taking the toe of her shoe, going round and round on the dirt on the floor of the barn. And immediately John felt really bad. Linda was their only child, and he loved her dearly, and now he'd hurt her feelings. And he knew where that inspiration of giving something to Mr. Riggs had come from, because Jane, his wife, was the most generous, giving person there was. And she didn't let anybody talk her out of giving. And he thought, I gotta fix this. He got down on his knees in front of little Linda and he said, oh, honey, I'm sorry. If you want to give Mr. Riggs a present, a pair of mittens, it's okay with me. And her little head came up and the little face started to smile again. And she said, thank you, Daddy. And she disappeared out of the barn. Well, over the next few days, Mother cut out a pair of mittens out of an old pair of Daddy's overalls. And then she'd gone up to the attic and looked through all her boxes. And when she came down, she had the brightest red piece of material Linda had ever seen. And she cut out for the front of those warm mittens that red. And she made 2 pairs for Mr. Riggs. Now, I say she made them. Mom cut them out, and she knitted the knitting for around the ends of them to keep it shut, to keep the hands warm. But she gave the mittens to Linda, and she said, you sew them up, you know how. So Linda had. So within just a couple days, those mittens were ready. And Jane, Mom, had gone into the kitchen and she'd baked a whole batch of molasses cookies. And she got out a box and they put Linda's mittens and they put those molasses cookies and they sealed it all up and it was ready for Christmas giving. Well, on Christmas Eve, Linda gathered up that box and she put on her old coat and her mittens and her scarf and her hat, and she ran across the field to Mr. Riggs's house, and she went up his long driveway and up on his porch, and she set that little box right there, and she went away. When she got home, she was really excited for Christmas. The next morning, I'm sure that Mommy had made her some things out of stuff from the attic. It wasn't that she didn't have any presents. About 11 o'clock, Dad had finished watering all those cows, and he'd finished the chores. He'd brought the eggs in and the milk, and he'd come in and he was sitting down in his chair in the living room, and it was warm, and he was waiting. He could smell all the good smells coming out of the kitchen because Mommy and Linda were busy making Christmas dinner. And as he was sitting there rocking in his chair, he heard clinkety clink, 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 clink. And he thought, what is that? Pulled back the curtain and he looked out, And there, parked right in front of his house, was Mr. Riggs with his hands still on that steering wheel. He just stood there for a little bit. And his face looked, well, a little less sour today. And as John watched out the window, he very painfully, because he must have had arthritis and something in his legs and his hips, he got out of that big, tall Model T, and then he turned around to the side of it, and out of it he reached out and he pulled out this big grocery box, and he started carrying it up the porch. And he got to the door, and he knocked. And John went to the door, and he said, "Well, hello, Mr. Riggs. Come in where it's warm. Come on in." And Mr. Riggs said, "Merry Christmas." And he came in, and he set his box down on the dining room table. And Linda had heard him, and she came running in, and she said, "Mr. Griggs." And he said, with a smile even, he said, "Thank you for the mittens, Linda." And then John noticed those bright red mittens were on Mr. Griggs' hands. He said, "They're keeping my old hands warm." And then he said, "I brought you something." And he reached down in that big box, and he pulled out that bright blue little coat. And Linda went, "Ow! Ow!" Mr. Griggs had her try it on. And then girls and women have a bad habit of, when they're so happy, she started to cry. Oh! And Mr. Riggs, he reached up and he patted her on the head. And he looked at her and he said, "It's okay, Linda. I used to have a little girl like you, about your size, only she had red hair." "You had a little girl?" I said, "Yes." And then he became quiet. And Mom had come to the kitchen door. She had on her little apron, and she had been busy cooking away in her best dress. Mr. Riggs said, "Come here, Jane." And then, to John's amazement, Mr. Griggs stuck his hands in that box again, and he pulled out a leather purse that had leather work all over it in pretty patterns. And John thought, that purse must have cost more than the coat. But he didn't say anything. And as Mr. Riggs stuck it out to give it to Jane, he turned to John, a little more like himself again, and he said, "You don't mind if I give your wife a present, do you, John? It being Christmas and all." And John said, "No, that's fine." And he gave that beautiful purse to Mother. How exciting! John turned to Mr. Riggs, and he looked him in the face and he said, "Would you like to stay for Christmas dinner?" John really didn't know where that had come from, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And Mr. Riggs started to say, "No, I can't. I gotta go home and take care of the animals. You need Christmas as your family." And John said, "No, we want you to stay." And then up marched Jane, and she looked at him. She said, "No excuses, Mr. Riggs. I have plenty of food, and you're more than welcome to stay. Besides, you can't go now. I've already set a place for you at the table." So Mr. Riggs sat down, and he and John talked a little bit while the dinner was getting finished fixing. John had never visited with Mr. Riggs except to ask to get to the river on his property. So it was kind of nice just to talk to the old man. And then dinner was served, and it was so delicious. When they were about half done, Mr. Riggs looked up with a strange look on his face, and he looked at Jane and he said, "An old man sometimes forgets what it's like to have a woman do the cooking and make good things out of stuff. Thank you." And Jane, of course, said, "You're always welcome, Mr. Riggs." Well, after dinner was over, Mr. Riggs did say, "I really do have to go now, but thank you again. It was wonderful to have dinner with a family. And thank you for the present, Linda, and thank you for the cookies, Jane." And then when he got to the door, he put his mittened hand on that doorknob, and he stood there for a minute, and he turned around, and he looked at John, and he said, "John, on the very edge of my pasture, right by your pasture, there used to be a road that ran down through there. If you'd fence it in, I'd let you run your cows down that road. It goes right to the river, and it won't cost you a cent." John couldn't believe it. And Mr. Riggs, then he turned to little Linda and he said, "You bring your bucket, Linda, over to my house, and I'll give your family a whole bucket of those pears." And Linda said, "Mommy and Daddy, Mr. Riggs and I have been friends for a long time, and he always lets me eat his pears off of his tree. I'll come over and see you, Mr. Riggs. Bye-bye." Peace on earth, goodwill to men. That goodwill to men is all about what Christmas is about. Thank you, boys and girls. You have a Merry Christmas too, but we have at least 3 more Christmas stories, so you'll have to come back and listen every week. Bye-bye now. I'll see you next week.